Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 567th meeting of our Cleveland Civil War Roundtable. This is going to be a night of firsts. It's going to be our first in-person meeting since March 11, 2020. It's our first meeting at our new home, the Holiday Inn Independence. It's our first meeting that will be live streamed on our YouTube channel. And it will also be the first and last time that I have the opportunity to talk to you in person. Something that will probably sound very good to many of you for one reason or another.
You did a great job, Steve.
Thanks, John. It's been a long and arduous journey for our country since that Black Friday, March 13, when our nation began to shut down due to COVID-19. The Roundtable faced several challenges, and I would like to think our group has worked hard to overcome them. We had our first electronic election of officers, which we may not want to do again because I ended up president, but we were able to deliver our planned program of speakers using Zoom technology.
Hey, can we have a recount?
Who let him in? Oh my goodness. And we're trying to use live stream to provide a better experience for people who can't get here tonight. It's being delivered by using our very own YouTube channel, another new creation this year. We've worked very hard on improving the internal mechanics of our group, with an emphasis on communications. We have created and adopted an editorial policy for our publications, including the Charger, our website, any future ones we may create, including electronic ones. We initiated an editorial policy board to administer those policies, and these actions were designed to protect our club in the future from possible legal and other issues. We moved here to our new home at the Holiday Inn Independence. This is the culmination of a 2-year effort on the part of the last 2 executive committees, and I should call out Ellen Connolly for being the big leader in this. We were able to conduct a delayed field trip to Petersburg a few weeks ago, where 13 of us had a great time, including a couple of good dinners. And finally, we're able to host Mr. Terry Winschel this evening for our final program of 2020-21 in person. Yes, it's okay. It came a long way. It came from Vicksburg. All right. We accomplished all these things through the work of many people working together for our group, and I want to take a few minutes to recognize them for their contributions over the last year. And I want to say, first of all, we had more officers' meetings on a regular basis, usually monthly, than we've had in the past to help steer our way through this situation. Most of these meetings included officers and directors, and I want to say this very sincerely. I'm always going to appreciate their time, effort, and wise counsel over the last year. I was blessed with a wonderful set of officers, and I'd like to recognize them now, including Mark Porter, who served as vice president, Bob Pence. Well, first of all, Mark played a big help in a lot of initiatives, besides working diligently to set up next year's programs and field trips, even if he did steal one of my speakers. I won't hold that against him. Bob Pence, treasurer. Bob was trying to retire this year with limited success, but he did a great job of providing us with all the financial information we needed for our meetings. Lily Corte, our secretary over here, produced the best set of minutes from all our meetings I've seen in 4 years and played an important role in our social media efforts, including the website, Facebook, and Twitter accounts. Our Constitution calls for past presidents to serve as directors for 2 years after their tenure is over, and I was lucky to have both Ellen Connolly and Dan Ursu to help me out this past year. So, thank you. Ellen chaired the committee to create our editorial policies and serves as the first chairperson of our editorial review board. And Dan has served as a director and historian and is responsible for all the history briefs you've been reading this year on one of my favorite subjects, U.S. Grant and Vicksburg. Our other directors who served faithfully, attending meetings and helping with assignments and providing advice were Rich Ronick, Hans Kinsey, Mike Wells, and Dan Zeisers. Thank you all. I want to give a special recognition to what I called our Signal Corps, who played such an important role in the last year. First, the Charger, our monthly newsletter from September through May. Thank you, Mike and Catherine Wells and Dennis Keating, for your continued devotion to this Roundtable staple, and they put in countless hours of work every year to deliver this to us, and I think we all appreciate it very much. Our website, it went dark last summer, but has been brought back to life with the dedication and hard work of Dave Carino and Lily Corte, with the continued support from past webmaster Paul Burkholder. Dave has worked for over a year to move past articles from our old website platform to the new one. Lily has contributed her library and internet skills to help with organization and presentation of new material. Lily's also been our social media person for Facebook and Twitter, and has continued to put out efforts on this, including a few minutes ago when she said we were going to start late. And put that out on Twitter. Well, I joke about it. I can't emphasize the importance of these things enough. Several new members joined because they saw us on the internet. Several thousand people every year access our articles for information on the Civil War from our website. Others contact members who are listed on our Speakers Bureau section on the website. For instance, John Fazio and Mel Maurer gave presentations earlier this year to the Royal Air Force Defense Seminar in England. They were contacted as a result of a website search. And Dan Zeiser, what can I say? I called him the Dean of our Signal Corps. He has been Mr. Reliable. We rely on his members and friends email list to keep you all informed. The wonderful thing is, I could send a request to Dan to send a message and always get same-day service to get in touch with you. He was also on the editorial committee and is serving on the editorial board. We created a backup email system this year after creating and verifying an up-to-date membership list, which has appropriate contact information. We plan on using it as a members-only tool while Dan broadcasts to a wider audience. I also want to thank a new member, Andrew Mangles, for his help in getting us started in using Zoom this year. Andrew is director at Westlake Porter Library. It was a busy year for him, but he found time to help us on a regular basis with the intricacies of Zoom. Without his help, we would not have had the September meeting with Will Green, and our debate in January would not have been nearly as effective. I also want to thank Tommy Solomon, who's over here, who served as our internet IT consultant and help desk guy for all things internet. Tommy provides the same services for the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, and we couldn't have had a good year without him. And speaking of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, I want to give a shout out to Tim Daly over there, who's retiring, and I hope everybody will maybe send something along to him to thank him for his years of service. They have been a big help to us this year. We started the year with, they set up a special tour for Will Green back in September, and they did the same thing today for Terry Winschel and our guests. So thank you very much. And in the unlikely event she's watching, I want to thank my wife Lynn, who actually has, for the last 12 years, has run a very large not-for-profit volunteer organization, and gave me friendly advice on things that we should or should not do, along with being very patient when, after we downsized in September, and I said, honey, I can't do that right now. I got Roundtable stuff to do, and she didn't kill me, so thank you. She can't be here tonight because it's book club night. She's a retired librarian, not that we know any of them. Okay, and finally and very seriously, I want to thank all of you for hanging in there over the last year, having faith in our group and showing up for Zoom meetings, paying your dues, and providing other support. So give yourself a hand there, please. Well, we made it through, and I'm looking forward to an exciting year next year as Mark Porter has really put together a wonderful program, an exciting field trip to Chickamauga and Chattanooga. And, well, where'd I put it? Oh, if you haven't, mark your calendars now, September 23 to 26 for our field trip to Chickamauga and Chattanooga. And speaking of Mark Porter and other people who I will mention right now, in our Constitution it says that the nominating committee needs to recommend people to hold officership in the next year. And that recommendation has been issued, and we have received from them the recommendation that Mark Porter serve as president, Lily Corte serve as vice president, Bob Pence serve as treasurer, and Jimmy Mankhouse serve as secretary.
So move the slate be accepted.
Second?
I move to close the nominations.
I love it, just like we used to do in Chicago. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Yes, great. All right, fantastic. Thank you all very much. All right. Okay, introduction of guests. I have Mr. Ron Von Troba, late of Bay Village, and the U.S. Air Force, among other things, who now resides in Fairhope, Alabama, with me tonight, my old friend. Terry, do you want to introduce?
My guess is Lee Fenner. Lee and I worked together at Vicksburg National Park a little over 40 years ago. As I went on for a career in the National Park Service, Lee went on to serve in a different capacity in the U.S. Air Force, retiring as Lieutenant Colonel. He now teaches school here in the Cleveland area.
Any other tables with guests that they want to introduce? We're going to do them in a minute. Okay. Any other guests? Okay, new members. Anybody who has joined since March 11th, 2020. Please stand up and introduce yourself. Yes.
Oh, Bob Cutler, I thought I had joined back when we were at the Judson Manor, but somehow I didn't have you on the list, so I did it again tonight.
Great. We're glad to have you with us. Gene.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gene Clare. I'm a member, also a member of the American Battlefield Trust and supporter of American Battlefield.
Well, I haven't joined yet, but we're in the process.
Close.
Water, my wife Patty. It's our first meeting, so we're really enjoying it.
Great.
Welcome.
Okay, well, we hope to see you all in September. And now we have the ritual of the 50-50 raffle with Mr. Porter. And do you want Terry to pick the numbers?
Pot was $110, $55 to the winner, and we'll ask our speaker to go ahead and draw a. And please read the last four numbers.
Last four numbers. 4, 8, 9, 3.
4893. Silence from the crowd. Really? 4893. Well, pick another one.
Ooh.
Last four digits. 4, 9, 3, 1.
4931. Yay!
$55 to the winner.
I got my money back.
And we appreciate the support because it puts $55 into the kitty for the roundtable, which means we actually break even tonight. So, thank you.
Yes, and who's wearing one of the new hats that they got tonight so they can model it for the TV audience that is hopefully looking? You know, we've got more of these, so when you show up in September, please bring an extra $10 to help contribute to the overall organization and get yourself a Cleveland Civil War Roundtable hat. Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, and that is Terry Winschel, perhaps the leading living historian regarding the Vicksburg Campaign. His title of his presentation is Shut Up as in a Trap, Citizens Under Siege at Vicksburg. And his presentation focuses on the plight of the civilians in Vicksburg during the siege of the city. and the civilian population who experienced war and all its horrors during 47 days of siege. So Terry is going to try and tell us about their story this evening. And he's going to have a PowerPoint presentation with some slides and faces and of the people who went through this. I'm really excited that Terry's here and that he was able to be here. I can't tell you how delighted I was. I'd been in touch with him for, I think, about 2 years. We've been talking about this. And he sent me an email and said, "Hey, I got both my shots. Would you like me to come up?" And I talked to the rest of the officers, and we all thought it was worth a try to have a meeting. And it looks like we pulled it off, and we've got a fair number of members here. I had the opportunity to meet and talk with Terry on some of my trips to Vicksburg, which I know you've all heard about how I had clients there, so I had to rough it and go down there early. That's what I told my wife, so that I could get on the battlefield. And it was always a delight to see Terry because he is a really wonderful historian. He is a wonderful gentleman, truly a kind and patient person who put up with all kinds of pestering questions and signed all the books I asked him to sign. So he has been retired, he says, sort of, right? After spending 35 years with the National Park Service, starting at Gettysburg and ending up at Vicksburg, which I just heard was kind of like the different side of the moon or something, far side of the moon. The dark side of the moon, okay. But he's been working part-time with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who are, interestingly, have a headquarters in Vicksburg. And so he's been with them. Terry's written over 100 articles on the Civil War. He's the author of several books, including many I have, like Triumph and Defeat, the Vicksburg Campaign, the Civil War Diary of a Common Soldier, William Wiley, the 77th Illinois, Vicksburg, Fall of the Confederate Gibraltar, and Vicksburg is the Key. So I can't think of a better way to complete our program this year than to introduce Terry Winschel for his presentation.
Thanks, Steve.
It's ready to go.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thanks, Steve. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Although honored by your kind invitation to be here this evening, I am more deeply honored by your presence, and I thank you for this opportunity to share with one another our love of history. Before I begin, allow me to convey my heartfelt thanks to Steve for making this program possible, and to Steve and Ron for making today such a delightful afternoon with my friend Lee, and for the many acts of kindness you extended our way. Thank you so very much. I suspect that most people in this room are familiar to one degree or another with the story of the Vicksburg Campaign. It is a stirring tale of heroism, courage, and perseverance by American soldiers unexcelled in the annals of our nation's history. Sadly, though, most works on the Vicksburg Campaign focus almost exclusively on the military operations that centered on the city and fail to address a key element in the equation, namely the civilian population of Vicksburg, who experienced war in all its horror during the long 47 days of siege. Who were these people, and what is their story?
Here we go already.
All right.
Let's see what's happening. You've got it there, right?
Yeah, this is the first one. Is the projector not on? Anybody who knows me can testify. All I have to do is come near technology, and all of a sudden sparks and smoke start emitting from any machine.
I think it went into a standby.
Oh, okay.
We're gonna have to let it warm up.
Here it comes. Well, let's see here.
Wouldn't hurt. Yeah. I think they had it down there before. Okay, yeah, let me, Can you turn the lights down up here a little bit?
Yes.
Thank you.
Very good. It is the story of people such as Emma Balfour, shown here, an attractive Vicksburg socialite, and her husband William, a prominent physician. Of Mary Loughborough from Missouri, who followed her soldier husband James across the great river and was trapped in the doomed city. Of Margaret Lord, whose husband was rector of Christ Episcopal Church, the cornerstone of which had been dedicated by then Bishop Leonidas Polk in 1839. And it is a story of thousands like them, nameless faces today. Theirs were the faces of the young and the not so young, faces that were clean-shaven or heavily bearded, faces of men and women and children, those who were free or slave native Mississippians and immigrants. Collectively, they were the citizens of Vicksburg, nearly 5,000 in number in 1860 when Civil War tore the nation asunder, a war which fate cruelly dictated would directly impact their lives more so than people in any other American city, north or south. Situated on the east bank of the Mississippi River, the city was founded by and named for the Reverend Newitt Vick, a Methodist minister from Virginia, who in 1812 first viewed the Father of Waters from the heights on which the city now stands. But it was the silent water of the great river that gave birth to the town and nourished its soil. Through industry and thrift, those who followed Vick quickly tamed the land and traditionally yielded a bountiful harvest. An abundance of wood, cotton, and foodstuffs soon ushered in brisk and profitable trade with cities and towns along the river and its tributaries. The steamboats that plied the Mississippi River at Vicksburg came from New Orleans, Memphis, St. Louis, Louisville, Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh, and brought prosperity to the city on the hill, which grew in wealth and charm to become by 1860 the second largest city in the Magnolia State and was considered by many among the most beautiful in the South. Situated high atop the bluffs, overlooking the river, Vicksburg attracted people from throughout the region and beyond, each one of whom added a new dimension to the city. Variety came to characterize the people in their city. By 1860, noted one historian, the hills were tiered with buildings. Long, low warehouses lay along the waterfront. 3 blocks up from the river, the finest shops and stores lined Washington Street. Farther away from the river, Greek Revival homes, shielded by fences and hedges, stood aloof from the streets, and less pretentious houses were stacked along the hillsides. The most prominent structure was the Warren County Courthouse, built by slave labor on the highest hill in Vicksburg. Completed in 1858, the courthouse symbolized not only the city's prominence as the county seat, but proclaimed to the world that Vicksburg was a bold, confident, and dynamic community, traits that would lead the city during the war and sustain her people in their darkest hour. Although noted for its charm and beauty, it was the people of Vicksburg who gave it its identity, its flavor, if you will. They were a mixture of people from across the South with a sprinkling of Northerners and immigrants from more than a score of foreign lands. This diversity was reflected in every aspect of community life, from architecture to clothing, social customs to religion, and made Vicksburg unique among the towns along the Mississippi. These people, together with the agricultural community served by Vicksburg, supported almost 100 shops, banks, stores, factories, and business houses of one sort or another, noted historian Peter Walker. In his classic study of the city entitled Vicksburg, A People at War, 1861 to 1865, Walker writes, "Wholesale grocers, commission merchants, and cotton brokers held the largest business interest in the city. Druggists, gunsmiths, tailors, jewelers, insurance salesmen, publishers, bookbinders, carriage makers, stove and boiler makers, photographers, bakers, confectioners, nurserymen, liquor dealers, and dressmakers catered to the legitimate wants and wishes of the people. Professional men, as well, were abundant in Vicksburg, where lawyers, doctors, and teachers all made a good living. The city was also home to political figures of renown on both the state and federal levels.
On the eve of Civil War, Vicksburg boasted of 6 newspapers which covered the gamut of political views, including the Daily Citizen, which during the siege would be printed on wallpaper. 4 fire companies, the Washington, Constitution, Phoenix, and Independent, provided amusement to the people as they raced one another to fires and sometimes even put them out. There were churches and civic organizations to suit any denomination or interest, and hotels and brothels to fit any pocketbook. There was a cosmopolitan air to the community where the merchants and professional men ruled. Their position and the city's wealth were enhanced with the arrival of the railroad in the 1830s. By 1860, the iron rails connected Vicksburg with Jackson and points eastward to the Atlantic seaboard. From Jackson, connecting lines ran north to Memphis and south to New Orleans. Across the Great River, the rails stretched over Louisiana on their way to Texas. The sustained economic growth provided by the railroads promised a bright future for Vicksburg. But throughout the antebellum period, the railroads could not compete with the steamboats, and the heartbeat of the town emanated from the docks along the waterfront. Their slaves, free men of color, and Irish immigrants unloaded the precious cargoes of finished products and luxury items such as silks, china, glassware, and wines, and loaded the boats high with the white gold of the lower Mississippi Valley, cotton. Vicksburg and her people enjoyed a special bond with the river. It was their river, and the silent, majestic water flowed beneath their town. Sarah Ann Dorsey of Louisiana recognized and understood that bond and referred to the citizens of Vicksburg as the keepers of the river. But just as the river gave life to the town, it would also bring the instrument of Vicksburg's destruction. As the nation drifted to the brink of civil war, the citizens of Vicksburg watched with mounting anxiety as the threat of secession spread as a cancerous disease across the South. Due to the city's unique demographics and its reliance on the river, Vicksburg was more conservative in its political views than most other southern towns. As the secession crisis reached a fever pitch, the citizens of Vicksburg went to the polls in November of 1860, and in expressing their pro-Union sentiments, cast their votes for John Bell for president. The election of the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, as president, however, spurred the fire eaters and secessionists throughout Mississippi and across the South to lead their states out of the Union. As Mississippians contemplated the momentous issue of secession, in Vicksburg, Marmaduke Shannon editorialized in his daily Whig, "The die is cast. Abraham Lincoln is President of the United States. What is our duty in this crisis in our national affairs? Shall we follow the mad and rash advice of the governor of this state? We do not mean to rebel against the government because an obnoxious man has been made president. We do not mean to raise the standard of resistance. Let others do as they will. For us, we will stand by the Constitution, the Union, and the laws." Still hopeful that secession and the war which would probably follow could be avoided, the citizens of Vicksburg elected pro-Union delegates to the secession convention that convened in Jackson in January 1861. Their voice, however, could not stem the tide of passion which engulfed the state, and on January 9th, Mississippi became the second state to secede. Church bells rang in joyous chorus across the Magnolia State, but the news of secession was met passively in Vicksburg with mixed emotions, reflective of the divided sympathy of its people. But the citizens of Vicksburg were Mississippians first and would slowly close rank in support of the state. The firing on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, followed by Lincoln's call for troops, crushed all hopes for reunification or peaceful secession. For good or ill, the citizens of Vicksburg found themselves at war, one in which their city would be the target of enemy guns. Defense of their homes was paramount, and the citizens of Vicksburg united in common cause. J.M. Swords, editor of the Daily Citizen, expressed the sentiments of the townspeople as he wrote, We can and will whip the black Republican hordes if they ever attempt to subjugate the South. An English visitor to the city in that spring of excitement noted in his diary that war fever is rife in Vicksburg. The men who flocked to the colors came from all walks of life and represented every strata of Vicksburg society. With dreams of glory and heroism dancing about in their heads, off to war they went with little comprehension of the horrors they were about to experience. Knowing that in war, the only certainty is death, one Vicksburg merchant, the firm of Ketching and Porter, advertised, "Our stock of mourning goods was never so complete," and their shelves carried a full line of black organdy, black silk grenadine, black Mozambique, black silk mitts, black kid gloves, and black lace veils. There would be far greater need for these items than the citizens of Vicksburg could have imagined in that spring of 1861. Scores of men such as these would never return from the bloody fields of battle. Scores more, such as this man, would be wounded and maimed for life, but all would be changed forever. By year's end, the citizens of Vicksburg began to feel the economic impact of war, as fewer steamboats tied up at the city's waterfront, and those that did carried mostly war supplies. Goods were still abundant, but rose rapidly in price. Unemployment also climbed. The Benevolent Society was formed by caring citizens who operated a free market to feed the families of the poor and unemployed. The Ladies' Hospital Association, sewing clubs, and an array of other organizations were formed to meet the specific needs of the people in Vicksburg and the soldiers who were stationed in and around the city. The use of homespun clothing and food substitutes were a clearer sign of the war's economic impact as the holiday season passed to begin a new year. The year 1862 ushered in calamity for Confederate forces responsible for the defense of the Mississippi River. A series of defeats at Forts Henry and Donelson and in the bloody Battle of Shiloh brought the tragedy of war to Vicksburg as hundreds of wounded soldiers arrived in town by train or by steamboat. Many of the townspeople watched as the soldiers, some of whom were their own sons, were unloaded and taken to the hospitals, which were soon filled to capacity. Mahela Roach, shown here, who helped care for the men, recorded that it was a sad sight and makes us realize that war is near us indeed. Most citizens, however, bask in a false sense of security, as Vicksburg was still 200 miles from the nearest enemy force. That sense of security was shattered in late April as the ships of David Glasgow Farragut's West Gulf blockading squadron bombarded and passed Forts Jackson and St. Philip, resulting in the fall of New Orleans. The loss of New Orleans shocked the citizens of Vicksburg, who now realized that there was nothing between them and the Federal fleet, only 5 days steaming time away. With the enemy expected daily in Vicksburg, Mahela Roach observed that bustle and confusion reign everywhere as people prepared to flee the city. Another resident, Annie Broderick, wrote that the people walked the streets aimlessly, as one does when troubled, with bowed head and saddened mien. It was like the slaying of the firstborn in Egypt. There was sorrow in every house. In Vicksburg, preparations for war began in earnest as the city took on increased significance. Jefferson Davis, himself a resident of Warren County, referred to Vicksburg as the nailhead that held the South's two halves together. On May 1st, Mansfield Lovell's troops that had evacuated New Orleans by train poured into Vicksburg and began construction of batteries overlooking the Mississippi River. As the soldiers labored on the fortifications, the Union fleet slowly steamed upstream. Baton Rouge fell to the Federals on May the 8th, Natchez, Mississippi 4 days later, and on Sunday, May 18th, the advanced flotilla of Farragut's fleet arrived below Vicksburg. In response to a demand for surrender, Lieutenant Colonel James L. Autry, the post commander at Vicksburg, wrote defiantly that Mississippians don't know and refuse to learn how to surrender to an enemy. If Admiral Farragut thinks he can teach them, let him try. While incensed by this response, federal officers ordered their gun crews to open fire upon the city. Men, women, and children, both black and white, went screaming through the city streets, recalled one panic-stricken citizen as a shot and shell crashed into buildings or landed in the city streets. Thousands of frightened citizens fled the city or sought shelter in caves that they had dug into the hillsides to escape the hail of iron that rained down upon Vicksburg from mid-May all through June and into late July. Such action kept civilian casualties to a minimum, the only fatality being Mrs. Patience Gamble, who was decapitated by a shell. By late July, Farragut's squadron, racked with sickness and plagued by rapidly falling waters, withdrew from Vicksburg to safer, deeper waters below Baton Rouge, while the ironclads, timberclads, and rams of the Brownwater Navy returned upriver to Helena and Memphis. The naval siege of Vicksburg, as it was called, ended. The city had withstood its first real test under fire, and editor Shannon wrote with pride in the pages of his daily Whig, "In the midst of all this, Vicksburg, gallant little Vicksburg, firm as the eternal hills on which she reposes, gazes boldly and defiantly upon her enemy." One resident who watched the fleet withdraw noted with jubilation, "What will they say in the North now about opening the Mississippi River? Huzzah for Vicksburg!" but added 9 groans for New Orleans. During the calm which followed the naval siege, Vicksburg was turned into a powerful bastion by construction of a ring of forts connected by a line of trenches and rifle pits. Guarding all the land approaches to the city, the line of works was formidable, but without adequate numbers of cannon or troops to man the line, Vicksburg remained vulnerable. The sense of vulnerability fueled the fears of those in the city, as by year's end, federal forces were again in motion toward Vicksburg. In response to the developing threat, President Davis, accompanied by General Joseph E. Johnston, arrived in Vicksburg on December 21st to bolster the morale of the people and inspect the city's defending army led by Lieutenant General John Pemberton. The president was impressed by the strength of the fortifications which ring the city. Johnston, however, declared the line of earthworks to be nothing but an elaborate trap and warned that certain disaster awaited the army which manned Vicksburg's defenses. Davis's visit was short, and the assurances he provided failed to assuage the fears of those who lived in the Hill City, while Johnston's keen military instincts only provided the citizens with ominous prophecy. The mayor and board of aldermen, at least, took a more pragmatic step and passed a resolution which called for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer to Almighty God that Vicksburg may be spared from the hand of the destroyer. Well, the destroyer, in the form of Major General William T. Sherman and his Union Expeditionary Force from Memphis, soon arrived. On Christmas Eve, the ranking officers of the Vicksburg garrison attended a gala ball hosted by Dr. William Balfour and his wife, Emma. Unaware of Sherman's approach, the officers danced the night away in their finest uniforms with the belles of Vicksburg. Suddenly, the music and dancing stopped when a courier covered in mud burst into the room and handed a warning message to the Confederate commander. Major General Martin Luther Smith, then in command of the city's garrison, exclaimed, "This ball is at an end. The enemy are coming down the river. All non-combatants must leave the city." The garrison was called to arms and prepared to do battle. Christmas Day, however, passed quietly in Vicksburg as the Federals ate their feast of hardtack and coffee aboard transports moored near Milliken's Bend upstream and opposite the river from Vicksburg. But the following day, the Union flotilla steamed up the Yazoo River and landed Sherman's men at the mouth of Chickasaw Bayou, north of town. Fighting escalated on December 27th and 28th as the Federals probed for an opening in the Confederate defenses. On Monday, December 29th, Sherman ordered his troops to attack, saying, "We will lose 5,000 men before we take Vicksburg, and may as well lose them here as anywhere else." In the battle which ensued, Union forces were quickly, easily, and bloodily repulsed. and the citizens breathed a sigh of relief that their prayers for deliverance had been answered. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy during the winter of 1862-1863. Prices in town continued to escalate, and the scarcity of goods became more painful. The influx of refugees and soldiers who poured into Vicksburg pushed the overstrained supply system to the breaking point. Business throughout the city was sharply curtailed because of limited resources. Butchers, for example, opened their shops only half a day as their shelves were empty. One woman complained, "I got with difficulty 2 chickens," and noted that an egg is a rare and precious thing. Although it had been a bleak Christmas, the new year was ushered in with the promise of hope. But as yet another year of war began, a more dangerous, determined foe prepared to advance against the city, and the people of Vicksburg watched with mounting anxiety as Major General Ulysses S. Grant marshaled his forces across the river at Young's Point and Milliken's Bend. The campaign that we're all most familiar with began in earnest in late March 1863 as Grant set his army in motion. Unaware of the enemy's movements in Louisiana, those in Vicksburg, citizens and soldiers alike, were caught off guard on the dark, moonless night of April the 16th when the Union fleet steamed into action. The townspeople were startled from their sleep by the sound of heavy guns and witnessed gunboats and transports pass the batteries. Mary Loughborough wrote of the terror of that night. "We could hear the gallop in the darkness of couriers upon the paved street. We could hear the voices of the soldiers on the riverside, the rapid firing from the boats, the roar of the Confederate batteries, and above all the screaming, booming sound of the shells as they exploded in the air and around the city." By morning light, all was quiet again, and the citizens went about their daily routines as if nothing had happened. Oddly enough, the people of Vicksburg garnered little information on the events which unfolded around them as the Union Army pushed deep into the Magnolia State. It was not until the 16th of May, when the roar of cannon at Champion Hill echoed through the city streets, that they realized the proximity of their danger. Uncertainty and fear crept into their hearts, but few would accept as truth the rumors of disaster and defeat which spread as wildfire throughout town. Sunday, the 17th of May, dawned bright and clear. "The birds are singing as merrily as if all were well," recorded Emma Balfour. "The flowers are in perfection, the air heavy with the perfume of Cape jasmine and honeysuckle, and the garden bright and gay with all the summer flowers." "Yet in all the pleasant air and sunshine of the day," wrote another woman, "an anxious gloom seemed to hang over the faces of the men, a sorrowful waiting for tidings that all knew now would tell of disaster. There seemed no life in the city. Sullen and expectant seemed the men, tearful and hopeful the women." Such hope, however, was in vain. The insightful Mrs. Balfour noted with a tinge of shame that all save the spirit of man seems divine. Indeed, for on that Sunday morning the armies again clashed along the Big Black River just 9 miles east of Vicksburg. The struggle resulted in the wild flight of Pemberton's army toward the city and its perimeter of forts. In Vicksburg, Mary Loughborough watched in horror as the soldiers clad in butternut and gray reached the city and recorded for posterity the events of that day as she wrote, "In all of the dejected uncertainty, the stir of horsemen and wheels began, and wagons came rattling down the street, going rapidly one way and then returning, seemingly without aim or purpose. Now and then a worn and dusty soldier would be seen passing with his blanket and canteen. Soon straggler after straggler came by, then groups of soldiers worn and dusty with the long march." Emma Balfour also witnessed the flood of soldiers who streamed into Vicksburg and wrote with trembling hand, "I hope never again to witness again such a scene as the return of our routed army. From 12 o'clock until late in the night, the streets and roads were jammed with wagons, cannon, horses, men, mules, stock, sheep, everything you can imagine that appertains to an army being brought hurriedly within the entrenchment. Nothing like order prevailed among the troops, as divisions, brigades, and regiments were broken and separated. Hundreds of men had no weapons. Entire batteries had been abandoned in the field at Champion Hill and along the line of the Big Black River. As the poor fellows passed, she noted, every house poured forth all it had to refresh them. Poor fellows, it made my heart ache to see them, for I know from all I saw and heard that it was want of confidence in the general commanding that was the cause of our disaster. Late that night, she confided to her diary the fears of many in Vicksburg, writing, "What is to become of all the living things in this place, shut up as in a trap? God only knows." On May 19th, and again on the 22nd, Grant hurled his army against the city's defenses, only to be repulsed with a loss of 4,000 men. During the assaults, the citizens of Vicksburg were introduced to war in all its horror, as shot and shell fell in the city streets and crashed through their homes. Public buildings soon filled to capacity with the sick and wounded of both armies, and the stench of death was ever present. Adding to the misery of their daily lives were swarms of black flies which feasted on the carcasses of man and beast. The defenders of Vicksburg, posted behind stout fortifications, had stood defiant in the face of a powerful and determined foe. Unable to take the city by storm, Grant began siege operations to reduce Vicksburg and its garrison into submission by attrition. Throughout the month of May and into June, Union soldiers slowly extended their lines to the left and to the right until they invested the beleaguered city. Once the investment was completed, Pemberton's garrison was effectively cut off from all supply and communications with the outside world. For the citizens and soldiers trapped in Vicksburg, life soon became a terrifying quest for survival. They had to subsist solely on what they had stockpiled in Vicksburg prior to the siege, and with each passing day, those supplies dwindled until they were nearly exhausted. Disease began to spread rapidly through the ranks. Dysentery, diarrhea, malaria, various fevers, they all took a heavy toll of human life and were far more certain of death than was the enemy in blue that stood before them. As the siege progressed, a steady stream of men, first by the score, then the hundreds, could be seen to lay their weapons aside and walk or crawl as best they could to the hospitals in town. Public buildings were filled to capacity, and many fine private residences were converted to hospitals. But even there there was no succor, as medicines were in short supply. Each day the dead wagons, as they came to be known, made their rounds to the hospitals, and the dead were brought out in ever-increasing number and stacked as cordwood in the wagons and carried to their long rest and interred in the city cemetery northeast of town. Adding to the horrors caused by shortages of food and water, Union land and naval batteries shelled the city and its defenses. Powerful batteries were established along the siege lines as federal artillerists placed 220 cannon, many of which were rifled guns, and bombarded the fortress city night and day. Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter also moved his gunboats into position to engage the Confederate river batteries and stationed mortar scows on the opposite side of DeSoto Point. The large 13-inch mortars could hurl a 220-pound ball 1/2 mile into the air, which at the height of its trajectory, according to the citizens, blocked out the afternoon sun. When the bombs crashed to earth, the explosion created a crater almost 15 feet deep, 30 feet across. There appeared to be no safety anywhere. Life under siege soon translated to life underground, as citizens and soldiers alike dug deep into the lowest hills and hollowed out rooms in which to live. At first, those who fled to the caves found the conditions abhorrent. When we went into the cave this evening and sat down and recorded one resident of town, the earthy, suffocating feeling as of a living tomb was dreadful to me. I fear I shall risk death outside rather than melt in that dark furnace. Mrs. Balfour wrote in similar terms of her experiences. As all this rushed over me and the sense of suffocation from being underground, the certainty that there was no way of escape, that we were hemmed in, caged, for one moment my heart seemed to stand still. It was a feeling that she and others would grow accustomed to over the next 6 weeks. Mary Loughborough, whose husband James was an officer in Pemberton's army, was forced underground with her daughter to seek shelter from the artillery projectiles which fell like rain upon the city. Of her experience, she lived to write. The caves were plainly becoming a necessity, as some persons had been killed on the street by fragments of shell. The room that I had slept in had been struck by a fragment of shell during the first night, and a large hole made in the ceiling. I shall never forget my extreme fear during the night and my utter hopelessness of ever seeing the morning light. Terror-stricken, we remained crouched in the cave, while shell after shell followed each other in quick succession. I endeavored, by constant prayer, to prepare myself for the sudden death I was almost certain awaited me. My heart stood still as we would hear the reports from the guns and the rushing and fearful sound of the shells that came toward us. As it neared, the noise became deafening. The air was full of the rushing sound. Pains darted through my temples. My ears were full of the confusing noise, and as it exploded, the report flashed through my head like an electric shock, leaving me in a quiet state of terror, the most painful that I can imagine, cowering in a corner, holding my child to my heart, the only feeling of my life being the choking throbs of my heart that rendered me almost breathless. As singly as they fell short or beyond the cave, I was aroused by a feeling of thankfulness that was of short duration, for again and again the terrible fright came over us in that night. Caves were the fashion, the rage over besieged Vicksburg, noted one terror-stricken resident. Negroes who understood their business hired themselves out to dig them at from $30 to $50 according to size. Buying and selling of caves became a brisk and often lucrative business. One citizen explained, many citizens, considering different localities unsafe, would sell them to others who had been less fortunate or less provident, and so great was the demand for cave workmen that a new branch of industry sprang up and became popular. The caves became so numerous that one woman remarked the hillsides were so honeycombed with caves that the streets looked like avenues in a cemetery. Despite life in a cave, many of the townspeople remained defiant. Among them was Emma Balfour, who entered in her diary on May 30th, "The general impression is that they fire at this city, and that way thinking that they will wear out the women and children and sick, and General Pemberton will be impatient to surrender the city on that account. But they little know the spirit of the Vicksburg women and children if they expect this." A woman whose remarkable strength would be taxed to the limit, she boasted with pride, "Rather than let them know that they are causing us any suffering, I would be content to suffer martyrdom." Her sentiments were shared by many in the early days of the siege. But as the bombardment continued day after weary day, week after bloody week, even the resolute began to weaken. Civilians soon realized that they were not immune to the death of the battlefield. Although figures vary as to the total of civilian casualties, the harsh reality was that innocent men, women, and children died victims of war. Mrs. Loughborough recorded in her journal the death of one child. "Sitting in the cave one evening, I heard the most heart-rending screams and moans. I was told that a mother had taken a child into a cave about 100 yards from us, and having laid it on its little bed, as the poor woman believed in safety, she took her seat near the entrance of the cave. A mortar shell came rushing through the air and fell with much force, entering the earth above the sleeping child, and oh, most horrible sight to the mother, crushing in the upper part of the little head and taking away the young, innocent life without a look or word of passing love to be treasured in the mother's heart." The dreaded bombs preyed on those in Vicksburg regardless of gender, race, or age. A little Negro child playing in the yard had found a shell, recalled one resident. The discovery ended in the death of the child, who, in rolling and turning it, had innocently pounded the fuse. The terrible explosion followed, showing as the white smoke floated away the mangled remains of a life that to the mother's heart had possessed all of beauty and joy. A Confederate soldier observed that the only time the shelling stopped was when the Federal artillerists ate their morning, noon, and evening meals. During these brief intervals, when silence reigned, many who lived in Vicksburg were lured into a false sense of security and ventured forth from their caves. Often they were trapped on the city streets when the shelling resumed and had to dodge the deadly projectiles as they raced for the shelter of their caves. Not all, however, reached safety. The observant Mrs. Loughborough captured one such tragedy, writing, "A young girl, becoming weary in the confinement of the cave, hastily ran to the house in the interval that elapsed between the slowly falling shells. On returning, an explosion sounded near her. One wild scream, and she ran into her mother's presence, sinking like a wounded dove, the lifeblood flowing over the light summer dress in crimson ripples from a death wound in her side caused by a shell fragment." The suffering of those in Vicksburg would haunt for the remainder of her days one woman who clung to safety in the caves. "The screams of the women of Vicksburg were the saddest I have ever heard," she later wrote of those who lost loved ones to Union shells. "The wailings over the dead seemed full of heart-sick agony. I cannot attempt to describe the thrill of pity mingled with fear that pierced my soul as suddenly vibrating through the air would come these sorrowful shrieks, these pitiful moans, sometimes almost simultaneously with the explosion of a shell." During one of the more intense periods of shelling, Margaret Lord, wife of the Reverend Dr. William Lord, rector of Christ Church, tried to comfort her daughter Lida as the family crouched in the basement of their house of worship. "Don't cry, my darling," she soothed the child, assuring her, "God will protect us." But the little girl could not be calm, sobbing, "But Mama, I'm so afraid God's killed too." Citizens and soldiers alike came to fear that death was certain should the siege continue throughout the summer. Everywhere they looked evidenced the destructive power of the besieging army, the grip of which was slowly strangling them into submission. "How blightingly the hand of warfare lay upon the town," observed Mary Loughborough, whose memory of life in the once beautiful city of Vicksburg seemed but a dream. Food supplies dwindled, and just as with the soldiers who stood steadfast in the trenches, the citizens came to stare at starvation. Prices for all commodities were exorbitant, as goods of any kinds were practically non-existent. By the end of June, one could walk through the marketplaces along Washington Street and there see skinned rats hanging for sale. The shortages of even life's basic necessities was painfully more apparent as the Daily Citizen, Vicksburg's leading newspaper, came to be issued on wallpaper. Yet, in the midst of suffering and death, there was new life. At least 2 children were born in caves during the siege. In honor of the circumstances which greeted his arrival into the world, one little boy was christened William Siege Green. For the newborn babies, their parents, and all others in Vicksburg, there were also reasons for hope. Surely the authorities in Richmond would not forsake a city as significant as was Vicksburg to the Confederacy. Knowing that General Joseph E. Johnston had been sent to Mississippi by President Davis to rescue Vicksburg and its besieged garrison, relief was on their minds, and their constant prayer was for deliverance. But as we all know, that relief never came, and the sands of time expired. On the hot afternoon of July 3rd, white flags of truce appeared along the lines. A trio of officers in gray, led by General Pemberton, rode out from the city along the Jackson Road and beyond the defense line. Riding to meet them was a larger cavalcade of officers in blue, led by General Grant. The two generals, however, failed to come to terms during this face-to-face meeting, but agreed upon a cessation of hostilities and a continued communication through an exchange of notes until the surrender terms were agreed upon. Late that night, Grant sent in his final terms, which were accepted by Pemberton in the pre-dawn darkness of the 4th of July. The siege of Vicksburg was over, word of which spread quickly among the civilian population as the first streaks of dawn brightened the sky. The morning was deathly quiet, and as the people of Vicksburg grappled with emotions, the valiant defenders of the city marched forth from their works, stacked their arms, unbuckled their accoutrements, and furled their flags. Those who had remained steadfast to the end broke down and shed tears unashamedly as they returned to their works to await what fate held in store for them. Venturing forth from the caves that had sheltered them through the long ordeal of the siege, the citizens slowly returned to their homes to await their own fate at the hands of Union occupation forces. Young Lucy McRae was moved to tears by the sights which enveloped her as she reached the family home on Main Street, accompanied by her younger brother. "How sad was the spectacle that met our gaze," she wrote, arms stacked in the center of the streets, men with tearful eyes and downcast faces walking here and there, men sitting in groups, feeling that they would gladly have given their lifeblood on the battlefield rather than hand them over the guns and sabers so dear to them. Echoing those sentiments was Margaret Lord, who with a heavy heart watched as our poor soldiers came in a continuous stream past the house, so pale, so emaciated, and so grief-stricken, panting with the heat, and oh, saddest of all, without their arms and colors. When informed by her husband James that Vicksburg had surrendered, Mary Loughborough wandered from her cave for the first time in days. On the hill above us, the earth was literally covered with fragments of shell, parrot, shrapnel, and canister. She was amazed that anyone escaped the missiles of destruction which rained down upon the city for weeks, and recorded in her journal, "Many balls lay in every direction, flattened, dented, and bent from their contact with trees and pieces of wood in their flight. The grass seemed deadened, the ground plowed into furrows in many places, while scattered all over like giant's pepper in numberless quantity were the shrapnel balls." Despite the appalling sights, for those who had survived the constant bombardment by Union cannon and heavy mortar, the most stunning sensation was silence. "It seems to me I can hear the silence and feel it too," gently breathed Dora Anderson. "It wraps me like a soft garment. How else can I express this peace?" Resigning herself to the silence, Mary Loughborough expressed the sentiment of many in Vicksburg as she sighed, "Amen." Residents who had fled the city prior to the siege slowly returned that day. Ida Barlow, shown here, was one who returned to Vicksburg on July 4 and noted, "Starving men, women, and children, with rags hanging to them, stalked the streets in utter despair. They had given all for their country and had not left but a feeble claim to life, and this they were ready to give also." Truly, they had lost most everything but life itself and the will to survive. Kate Stone, who returned to home, laid desolate by war, typified the spirit of those who resumed life in and around Vicksburg. "We must bear our losses as best we can," she boldly proclaimed. "Nothing is left us but to endure." And endure they would, these noble people, the ravages of war, the humiliation of occupation, and the pains of reconstruction, to make Vicksburg once again a shiny city on the hill. These then, my friends, were the citizens of Vicksburg and their experiences of war and stories of life under siege. From this day forward, may the very name Vicksburg remind you of the people whose faces you have just seen and bring to mind their words. May their words invoke in you the basic human emotions that connect people of all generations throughout the history of mankind, and may those emotions enable you to transcend barriers of time and distance when you visit the battlefield or read of the famous siege, and place you in the midst of the people of Vicksburg who experienced the most trying ordeal of their lives in a struggle to survive. And with that, I thank you. Thank you. Questions? Sir?
You may have said this, if you did, I missed it. How many
We don't know those figures. You'll see that the figures that have been given range widely from a low of 2 to a high of 50. I suspect a more accurate estimate would be about 15. During the course of the siege, the Daily Citizen, Vicksburg's leading newspaper, was published on wallpapers, and several of those editions still exist today. And in the pages of the Daily Citizen, J.M. Swords actually published a listing of all the civilians who had been injured or killed on that particular day. I think a high was 100 civilian casualties, not fatalities, but casualties in one day. But we don't have all of those newspapers. So we do know that surely several hundreds were casualties, and probably somewhere about 15 to 20 were actually killed outright. Now that would just be the white population. They did not give the names of the black citizens who were killed or injured during the course of the siege, and we know there were some of them too.
Thank you.
Sir?
My perception is that most people of the day never travel too far from their homes, maybe 10 or 15 miles at most. Do the people in Vicksburg, because of their proximity to the river and the railroad, more apt to travel and maybe take a weekend down to New Orleans or something like that, or is it the same for them?
Oh, without question. There's so many of those that could afford it. The middle class, the upper middle class, the wealthier class, they would certainly take journeys down to New Orleans or upstream to Memphis. And they would do that frequently, especially during what was called the social season. The social season is a period of time each year where the Mississippi is in flood. Now, if you've ever been to Vicksburg, you know that Vicksburg sits up on bluffs about 300 feet high. West of the river, on the opposite side, it's nothing but low, flat land in Louisiana. So when the river annually floods, it covers much of that territory in Louisiana. And that's where so many of the wealthier people of Vicksburg had their plantations. So the plantation homes were in Louisiana. Their townhouses were on the high ground, either in Vicksburg or downstream in Natchez. So when the plantations were underwater, they retired to their townhouses for the social season, and for a period of roughly 3 to 4 months, all they did was go from house to house to house, entertaining one another. Now, the poorer folks certainly could not afford that luxury of travel, and even during the course of the campaign itself, they had nowhere to go, so they were stuck in the city. Those that could fled the city before the Union Army actually approached. Many would go up to Madison County or Yazoo County to the north. Some would even go down to Adams County where Natchez is located. But the majority of townspeople, we suspect, remained behind in the city and were subjected to the hardships of war. Sir?
There are a lot of headstones in Vicksburg.
Large numbers.
I don't know. You were at Gettysburg also. Vicksburg, Gettysburg.
In terms of acreage, Gettysburg is a much larger national military park. In terms of monuments, it's neck and neck. At Vicksburg, currently there are 1,380 monuments, markers, tablets, and plaques, making it one of the more densely monumented battlefields in all the world. And the monuments of stone and bronze that you shall see there were executed by the foremost American and European sculptors of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and have collectively made Vicksburg, in the words of one Civil War veteran, the art park of the world. Whereas at Gettysburg, I'm sure most of you have been there, they have those flank markers, right flank, left flank marker, they count those in their total. So I think we have far greater number of monuments if you exclude those flank markers. In terms of a tour road, the Vicksburg tour road is much longer than the Gettysburg tour road. Our tour road is 16 miles in length. In terms of national cemeteries, Vicksburg is a much larger. In fact, Vicksburg is the largest national cemetery in the United States in terms of Civil War burials. There are 17,000 Union soldiers and sailors interred in the National Cemetery at Vicksburg. Sadly, of that number, 13,000 are unidentified. Now, what accounts for this large number? Surely not that number of men were killed or died during the course of the siege. That also includes those individuals who died during the occupation of the city. Now, the National Cemetery at Vicksburg was established in 1866, shortly after the Civil War, and by 1869, there are more than 17,000 interments in the National Cemetery. Now, over the years, the Congress of the United States has extended the right of burial in National Cemetery to other U.S. veterans, and so at Vicksburg we do have a number of Spanish-American War veterans, veterans of the 2 World Wars, and Korea, bringing the total number of burials to 18,300 approximately. Sir?
Yeah, a quick question. I know the your campaign's presentation was the citizen, the mental psyche they went through with the constant bombardment from both land as well as river.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at Grant's siege of Vicksburg in comparison to Grant's siege of Petersburg, where Petersburg was like 9.5 months and Vicksburg 3 months, would you say that the constant bombardment led to a shorter siege of Vicksburg compared to Petersburg?
No, I think what led to a shorter siege of Vicksburg is the fact that all the lines of supply and communications were cut. You recall that Grant establishes a line of circumvallation around the city, cutting off all land approaches to the city, including the railroad access, and with Admiral Porter's gunboats in the river, Vicksburg was a completely surrounded town. Whereas during the siege of Petersburg, there were a number of railroads in particular that radiated into the city. Grant would slowly cut them off one at a time, but all the way up until virtually the very end, until the day of the Battle of Five Forks, supply lines were still open into Petersburg. Now, the Petersburg siege lines are farther out from the city than they are at Vicksburg. At almost any point along the Union siege lines around the city of Vicksburg with rifled artillery, you could hit any part of town as well as the Mississippi River. That was not the case at Petersburg. Sir, in the red.
You mentioned, 6,000 people at the time lived in Vicksburg?
There are 5,000 citizens of Vicksburg. That's black and white, 3,500 white, 1,500 black. Second largest city in Mississippi.
You mentioned, of course, what happened. It appeared to the white aristocratic people, or what it appeared to be.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to the slave trade? What was going on in Vicksburg before the siege?
Now, bear in mind that Vicksburg is a town. It's not so much an agricultural area. There's a much smaller slave population in Warren County than there is, for example, south in Claiborne County or Fayette County or Adams County or even north up into the Delta. Most of the blacks who were held in bondage in Vicksburg are house servants. Now, you also had free men of color in Vicksburg as well. Unfortunately, none of them left any accounts of their experiences of life during the siege. Now, when the garrison of Vicksburg is paroled, on July 4th, Grant offers the garrison parole. What is a parole? During the course of the Civil War, both sides captured large numbers of enemy soldiers, and taking care of prisoners of war proved very taxing for the administration in Washington as well as in Richmond. Consequently, the warring sides entered into an accord known as the Dix Hill Cartel, which outlined prisoner exchange, and it called for an equal exchange of prisoners, man for man, rank for rank. It even established a quota where a general officer was the equivalent of 60 privates. And I can assure you there were a lot of privates who were incensed at that exchange ratio. But under the Dix Hill Cartel, all I had to do was sign a parole, making an oath, if you will, promising to not take up arms against the federal government until exchanged. So on July 4, the garrison of Vicksburg becomes prisoners of war. All but 702 of those men signed a parole. Those who refused to sign a parole were sent northward to prison, but those who did sign those documents making that oath were sent to parole camps where they remained under the control of their own officers, fed and clothed by the Confederate government until notified that an equal number of Union soldiers, man for man, rank for rank, had either been released from prison or released from their paroles. Now, many of these Confederate officers in particular, they had black servants with them throughout the course of the siege. To them, these individuals were property, and under the terms of the surrender at Vicksburg, officers were allowed to keep their personal property. And so many of these officers tried to take their black servants out of the lines with them to these parole camps, and when Grant was notified by that, he put a stop to that immediately, saying these individuals are not property. Under the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation, they are now free individuals. So those blacks were retained in Vicksburg, and refugee camps were established to house these black residents. And thousands of blacks from the surrounding area, both in Louisiana and Mississippi, would flock to Vicksburg for the protection of the Union Army. And it proved quite taxing for the federal government to take care of these individuals. Sir?
Are there any remnants of caves?
Are there any remnants of the cave? Yes, I know of 6. There were hundreds of caves excavated throughout the Vicksburg area. Unfortunately, in the mid part of the 20th century, there were a number of cave-ins, and small children were suffocated. These caves were quite popular for children to play in, and several caves collapsed, suffocating children. And so in the 1950s, a city ordinance was passed, and all the caves that were still extant were either caved in or their entrances blocked off. But I still know of 6 that are accessible, but they're all on private property, and they were quite dangerous to go into. If I may give a humor story, during the course of the siege, these 2 elderly sisters, to escape the constant bombardment of federal guns, they left their house, but they hid behind a log in their backyard, and shells were falling all around them. When the shelling stopped, they both jumped up, hugged one another, and one sister said, "Oh, sister, are you killed?" To which she replied, "No, are you?" Another incident during the course of the siege, I mentioned how people were lulled into a false sense of security while the Union artillerymen ate their meals. Well, a mother and her child left their cave to run home to get an extra change of clothing, and on their way back to the cave, they stopped and were picking some flowers nearby to take into the cave when the shelling resumed. And so the mother grabbed the child, who had a handful of flowers, and as they were racing to the shelter of their cave, a shell exploded nearby, and they both tumbled to the ground. When the mother came to, she got up. She still had the child's hand in hers, and she ran to the safety of the cave. But when she got to the cave, she realized all she had was her daughter's hand. Other questions? Very good. Again, folks, I thank you so much. It's been delightful being with you here in Cleveland.
Don't run off. We have somebody.
Thank you.
Okay, well,
Don't want to forget my glasses.
Terry, we want to thank you very much for being with us this evening. It's become something of a tradition with the help of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument that we present our speakers with this flag and this certificate determining that on Abraham Lincoln's birthday on February 12, 2021, it flew over the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, and that's yours. So thank you very much for being here.
If I may say, next to the cross, sign of my Christian faith, there is nothing more dear to me than the American flag. Thank you.
Why don't the two of you stand together?
I guess we need that. Thank you.
Steve, thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, we did it. Yes, sir.
Are you finished, or?
Yeah, I was going to say see you in September, but, you know.
As is tradition, we have a gift for our outgoing president. So with the compliments and the gratitude of the membership, we present you this gift wrapped for your purposes, and we want you to open it in front of us so we know you got it.
Okay. Thank you.
You're lucky it's small, his wife won't throw it away.
Well,
You know, you're making her sound bad.
just as a note, folks, I propose 3 cheers to Steve Pettyjohn for the amazing job he did in the most trying and difficult circumstances faced by any Civil War Roundtable president ever.
Well, thank you all very much. Now all I have to do is get this open, right? Jeez. No pressure, no pressure. Yeah. Aha! Thank you very much. It's a minister's saber. Oh. Thank you. Well, again, thank you everybody for being here. It's great to end the year this way. And I wanted to end this by saying, see y'all in September. So, see you then. Thank you. Oh, wait a minute. The traditional treasurer plea to turn in your name tags on the way out, okay? Thank you all very much. Okay, Mr. Porter, you are going to leave before the UK.
I wanted to make sure you got it.
Oh,
and
thanks.
it was-
Yeah, this is going to be very nice. It's just the right size. And what is the letter I changed it? Thank you, Terry. This is terrific. I love it. Absolutely.
You have to look at Calgary's budget. To the extent they had a.
Sir.
1860. Like that.
Yes.
But like
Steve, are we getting into the big sword too?
What?
Are you getting into the big sword too?